I'd like to welcome you to our event, which is organized by us, Istanbul Policy Center, and the International Hrant Dink Foundation. I am very pleased and honored to introduce to you Professor Timothy Garton Ash, who needs no introduction, but I would actually say a couple of words about him. This event is part of our book launching series, and last year we also started a new type of event which focuses on critical issues. Last year we did one with Kemal Dervish on the European sovereign debt crisis, and this year our event is with Timothy Garton Ash, and the issue is free speech in media and freedom of speech in general sense. And our book launching events and critical issue gatherings are organized by Ayşe Kadıoğlu, the member of the Istanbul Policy Center Advisory Board. And I will actually give the floor to Ayşe, but I'd like to say a couple of things about this event, and especially Timothy Garton Ash. As I said, he needs no introduction. He is one of the eminent people of Europe and the world. And according to Time magazine, and the other one, he is actually one of the most influential 100 people in the world. But of course, he is the professor of European Studies at Oxford, member of St. Antony's College, and also Stanford University. But of course, with his ideas, his column at the Guardian, his regular appearances in New York Book Review, New York Times, Washington Post. He is one of the prominent intellectuals, theoreticians, philosophers that have done a great job in contributing, intervening with the way in which we think about Europe, European modernity, modernity at large, diversity and unity. And recently, what he will actually share with us is his work on diversity and with respect to freedom of speech. And but of course, when we talk about freedom of speech, which has a number of connotations and dimensions, and one of them is this recent issue, hate speech, hate crime, and the leading scholar in Turkey and abroad, Professor Yasemin İnceoğlu from Galatasaray University, invited her to give us her comments on what Timothy will be saying, and also freedom of hate speech and hate crime in Turkey. We have one of our doyens, Hasan Cemal from Milliyet newspaper. He will talk about freedom of speech in media, and we have, of course, Halil Berktay, who is actually one of the most significant and thought-provoking names in Turkey and abroad in terms of freedoms, speech, and the other issues. And we have Kerem Öktem from Oxford University, whose book Angry Nation was also one of our book launching series, and his ideas about freedom of speech is very well come too. So thank you very much for coming. I hope I'm quite sure we have a very productive discussion, and I further give the floor to Ayşe Kadıoğlu, who is the main organizer of this event.
Okay, let me also welcome you once again in the name of Istanbul Policy Center at Sabancı University and the Hrant Dink Foundation. One of the most difficult points of the debate on free speech involves not whether we should have it or not, because it goes without saying that we should have it, but perhaps how to limit free speech. The task perhaps is to discuss how much value we place on free speech in relation to the value we place on other important ideas. So that is why we titled today's panel as Limits to Free Speech, in the hope that we will talk about not only existing real limits to free speech, but also tackle the issue of how to limit free speech. Now, we're fortunate enough to have one of the most important public intellectuals of our times, Timothy Garton Ash, with us. And Timothy has written extensively on the issue of free speech in his column in The Guardian. He has also initiated this website that you see behind you at the beginning of this year on free speech, which could be reached at the address that you see above, freespeechdebate.com. I worked with Timothy last year in an advisory group for the Council of Europe. In the report that we ended up co-authoring with 7 other colleagues, we maintained that the battle for public opinion does not mainly belong in the law courts. Rather, it must be fought where it does belong, namely in the realm of public debate and deliberation. Now, if and when law should place limits to free speech is only one of the important questions that we hope to raise today. I have to admit I was quite influenced from Timothy's ideas on this issue, especially his criticism of what he famously called the memory police. That is, banning certain acts such as the denial of genocide via parliamentary decisions, or criminalizing statements that minimize the importance, if not outright denial of the Holocaust. Some of you may know there has been many court cases against writers such as Holocaust for referring to Islam. I believe he had said that it is the stupidest religion. So there has been court cases against them. Famous movie star, actress, and animal rights activist Brigitte Bardot was convicted by a Paris court for criticizing the Muslim ritual for of the sacrifice and demanding, in fact, that animals be anesthetized before they're slaughtered. Or another example that you won't like. I'm giving all these examples that you won't like, in the hope that it raises some, discussion, because it is easy to defend the right to free speech of someone you agree with. I think what is important is really to defend the right to free speech of, those ideas that are quite tasteless, in fact, in so many ways. So the leader, tasteless, I think, the leader of the Freedom Party in Netherlands, Geert Wilders, for instance, faced trial for the film he produced called Fitna, that is filled with remarks against the Quran. And because of this, in fact, he became a champion of free speech, despite the fact that he's someone who, in fact, who argued that Quran should be banned. Many other examples. One last, perhaps, is a British historian, David Irving, was imprisoned, in fact, in Austria for 1 year for denying the Holocaust. So these are just some of the examples. As I said, none of the actors are people with whose ideas I agree. But isn't this what the debate is all about? Tim uses the great expression fanatique sans frontières, about such views and the effort to stop, in fact, their expression. I was very much influenced from Timothy's take on these issues, mainly, I think, because I believe also in the importance and value of the realm of politics. And I think we should be quite skeptical about the conquest of the realm of politics and public deliberation by law. So with these initial thoughts, I would like to first turn to Professor Ash to hear his introductory remarks, and then we can go on with the panelists.
Thank you very much indeed. It's wonderful to be here in this almost theatrical setting. I feel almost want to burst into song, as it were, on the stage of the opera. I'm very pleased to be here, particularly because, as was mentioned, I'm now a member of the International Advisory Council of the Istanbul Policy Center, because, of course, the name of Hrant Dink has become one of the great names, one of the reference points in the global discussion of freedom of expression, and a name of great honor and note, and so it's a huge pleasure to do this also with the Hrant Dink Foundation, with my friend Ayşe Kadıoğlu, who I work together with on a Council of Europe working group on how we combine freedom and diversity in the wider Europe. the 47 countries of the Council of Europe, which in a sense is a large part of what we're talking about today. Or to put it the other way around, what we're talking about today, free speech, is a large part of the even larger agenda of combining liberty and diversity. And of course, with this very distinguished panel, who I look forward very much to hearing. You said that this was a book launch. I guess it's an unusual kind of book launch in the sense that there isn't yet a book. So it's a launch before the book, because what I've done here is something pretty unusual. I am writing a book about free speech, but at a certain point I realized that if your subject is the post-Gutenberg world, beyond the world of the printed book to the world of the internet and the mobile phone, it makes no sense to write a book about it in the old Gutenberg way. First write your little book, have it printed, and then have the debate. So we've turned it round. And what we've done first is in this big research project at Oxford to lay out with our whole team of experts and a fantastic team of graduate students at Oxford, to lay out a framework for an international multilingual debate on what should be the global norms for free expression. This will remain online in some form as a resource, as an online resource, but at some point I will then go away and write that incredibly old-fashioned thing, the book. But first the website. Now this is one of a series of events which I've done opening this up for discussion. The first one I did was memorably at the Brandenburg Gate, a speaker's corner at the Brandenburg Gate in Germany. 6 weeks ago I did an remarkable event with a very interesting panel just off Tahrir Square in Cairo. In 2 weeks' time I'll be doing something in Hong Kong. And if you think it's difficult to talk about free speech in some places, try talking about it in Beijing, where you can't even put it in the title. So there are worse places. But it's fantastic to be doing it in Turkey, because I do think, I said in a lecture yesterday, chaired by Osman Olagay, who would like to see here, that I thought that Turkey is a swing state for Europe. And I do think that Turkey is also, at least in some respects, a swing state for the freedom of expression issue. Because clearly, which way Turkey goes will have repercussions in the wider region. So let me just say a very few things in introducing this, and then I hope the panel will tell me everything we've got wrong or everything that we need to know about Turkey. First of all, the absolutely obvious elementary point. Freedom of expression is not just one among many freedoms. It is the freedom on which all other freedoms depend. It is the oxygen from which other freedoms breathe. And if freedom of expression is strangled, then the others will not be far behind, because you're not able to identify in the public sphere how freedoms are being eroded, you're not being able to combat them. So it's not just one freedom among many, it is the freedom that makes all others possible. Secondly, the starting point for this whole project is the transformed world in which we lived. I mentioned the post-Gutenberg world. You mentioned fanatiques sans frontières, who have unparalleled opportunities, as do the idéalistes sans frontières, or the journalistes sans frontières. Why? Because, to put it very simply, we are all neighbours now. We are all neighbours now. Either because we live in a big city, like London or Istanbul or Kuala Lumpur or New Delhi or Toronto, where you have people from almost every country culture, religion, language in the world. You literally rub shoulders, physically rub shoulders with people from everywhere. So the liberty and diversity challenge is posed. But also because we are all neighbours online. Roughly 2 billion people are connected worldwide on the internet. Very roughly, the estimates have to be approximate, another 2 billion by some sort of mobile phone or mobile device. So that's 4 billion people, potentially, who are all neighbours with each other. And if you look at the great free speech issues of our time, be they the Danish cartoons or privacy issues, be they WikiLeaks, whatever they may be, they always have this local and global dimension. The Danish cartoons became the issue it was only because of the internet, because of the global dissemination of these other local cartoons. So it's this global, local nexus. And what that means is that the classical way of thinking about free speech, and I'd be very interested to hear you on the subject, which is primarily about an individual state and what it does with its laws, what is to be allowed and not allowed in the United States, or in Canada, or in Turkey, or in China, has increasingly to be relativized. It is, of course, still very important. I wouldn't want to say otherwise, but it's quite inadequate to the challenges of this world in which we are all neighbours, in my view, in two ways. The first is the one that Aishka just mentioned. Because states have more difficulty imposing norms through laws, but also because, in principle, it is better that as little as possible should be done by law, only the necessary, and as much as possible we should work out for ourselves. Because working out for ourselves how we speak about human difference, what we say or express and how we express it, is part of growing up. It's part of being a grown-up, of being a mature citizen. And the danger of too much legislation by the state is that the state becomes your nanny, the citizen is infantilized. In fact, Aisha has an essay on the website precisely on this point about how state-imposed taboos end up infantilizing people. So in principle, wherever possible, it should be a matter of norms which we ourselves develop. They can be editorial norms. Every newspaper, every website has its own editorial code of practice. The BBC, every newspaper has that. Community norms, local community norms. Every university has its own code. Even circles of friends have their own norms, which are nowhere written down, and nonetheless important and part of civilization. And they don't have to be the same norms. And by the way, online, we have this amazing possibility that you can create your own self-governing communities, right? Virtual self-governing communities. In the past, you had to be in some sort of territorial space, or defined space. Here you can create your own online self-governing community and say, these are the community standards I want to abide by on this space. Wikipedia is a very good example of an online self-governing community. And that brings me to the other reason why it's less and less about individual states and their laws, which is that in this interconnected world of the internet, private powers are at least as important as public powers. If Facebook were a country, it would be the third largest country in the world. We actually have a map somewhere on the site, if I can find it, showing the social networks in the across the world, and you will see that Facebook has literally painted most of the globe blue. I'm sure I'm not going to be able to find it now. that Facebook has painted most of the world blue. So actually, what Facebook does is much more important than what France does. And what Google does is much more important than what Germany does. They are real global players. And for example, Facebook's privacy settings. I don't know how many people here. Show of hands, how many people here are on Facebook? Please, are you on Facebook? Put up your hand. There you are. Citizens of Facebook, well represented. Right, so you know Facebook's privacy settings. There's a certain age factor, I think I noticed in that too. So as you know, Facebook's privacy settings are a source of great controversy because they actually know more about you almost than you know yourself, right? And since Facebook makes all its money from knowing a great deal about you and then customizing advertising to you, it's interested in collecting more information about you than the Stasi did. If you put together what Google knows, i.e. your whole search history, which is the story of your life, and what Facebook knows, and what Twitter knows, and a few other media, you have a picture of you far more comprehensive than what the Stasi could find out in years of spying, and probably a bit more than what your wife knows too, or your partner. The greatest danger comes when you then get a collaboration between the public and the private power. That is a point of maximum danger. It's difficult enough if the state knows a lot about you. It's difficult enough if Google and Facebook know a lot about you. But if they get together, this has happened in the United States in the context of anti-terror legislation, where there's something called a FISA order, which means that security agencies can go to Google and Facebook and say, you must tell us everything you know about Mohammed X. And as often as not, it is someone called Mohammed X, or Ali. And you cannot even reveal the fact that you have been asked to give this information. The fact of the request is itself a secret. When you get that kind of collaboration between public and private power, it's extremely dangerous. So this point again about the private power. So here we have, so what we're doing on the website is to try and lay out, and the way we've tried to do this, to open up the debate, is to lay out, there you have some, 10 draft principles for global freedom of expression. These are not all prescriptions for laws. In fact, for the most part, they're not prescriptions for laws. They're broadly formulated, what I might call rules of thumb. Say underlying principles. So, for example, we defend the internet and all other forms of communication against illegitimate encroachments by both public and private powers. So it emphasizes this first order point I just made, that it's public and private powers. Then you have to say, so what's an illegitimate encroachment? Because clearly they're illegitimate ones as well as legitimate. So you click through, how would you like to vote on that? Shall I vote yes or no? All right, I'll take that as a yes. And then you have to give your email address, and I'll put that aside. And then we have a series of discussions, analyses, interviews, events. So we had a big event with the public policy director of Facebook on Facebook privacy and you, Rebecca McKinnon, a great internet expert, Nokia Siemens on the misuse of technology, Orville Shell on China, Tim Wu, who is a great internet expert. And there you have a series of case studies. Because of course, the truth about these is only revealed when you get to the level of the individual case and you test these principles against an individual case. The Berlin Twitter war versus the Great Far West, I'm familiar with. YouTube in Turkey. YouTube being banned in Turkey on the grounds that certain videos were insulting to Ataturk. This case will be well known to you. What's of course remarkable about it is that a lot of countries went to YouTube and said, block access in our country to certain content on YouTube. Turkey was almost unique, I think it's almost unique, in saying, take this stuff off, worldwide, everywhere. So no one can see it. I couldn't see it in Oxford, because it's offensive under, and in fact illegal under Turkish law. YouTube resisted, I believe, subject to correction. The current position is that it's blocked for IP addresses in Turkey. So if you have a VPN, of course, you can get around it, but for IP addresses in Turkey. So under every draft principle, we throw this open for discussion. I want just to highlight perhaps 3 or 4 of these, and then with one last comment hand it over to the panel. Firstly, principle 3, we require and create open, diverse media so we can make well-informed decisions and participate fully in political life. By the way, these principles and the whole website is presented in 13 languages. I hope you'll like the Turkish translation, which was done by 2 wonderful graduate students at Oxford who are with us in this room today. Open, diverse media so we can participate fully in political life. One of the classical arguments for free speech, actually since ancient Athens, how far realized in today's Turkey? Question mark. As was pointed out in the poster advertising this event, and as the New Yorker pointed out in an article in March, the rather shocking answer to the question, where are most journalists imprisoned at the moment, is not China or Iran, but Turkey. We speak openly and with civility about all kinds of human difference. This is the attempt to get at this liberty and diversity question and this incredibly difficult area of hate speech, which I know you're going to talk about. We actually have a fascinating debate on that between 2 leading scholars, legal scholars, one of whom makes passionately the case for hate speech legislation, Jeremy Waldron, a famous scholar, on the grounds of the harm of hate speech. That's that one there. And then a mighty powerful riposte by a leading liberal lawyer, Ivan Hanna, whose piece is provocatively called The Harms of Hate Speech Legislation, and who argues that the chilling effect of hate speech legislation is worse than the protection it gives to vulnerable minorities, and that in fact it often ends up actually in prosecutions for members of vulnerable minorities, because they tend to speak in rather extreme and indignant ways. Number 6, we neither make threats of violence nor accept violent intimidation. Remember Hrant Dink. This seems to me one where actually the monopoly of legitimate violence, which should be held by the state and the state alone, is called for. This is one area where it really does need not just the law, but behind the law, the force of enforcement. Hugely controversial one on religion. We respect the believer, but not necessarily the content of the belief. I'd like to hear some of you on that one. We have, of course, extremely lively discussions, which I can tell you about. Not just about Islam, by the way. Not just about Islam. The liveliest discussion is actually about Christianity. We should be able to counter slurs on our reputations without stifling legitimate debate. I think Kerem Öktem may like to say a little about that in Turkey. Last but not least, we must be free to challenge all limits to free expression justified on such grounds as national security, public order, and morality. I don't need to point out to you that a huge number of the restrictions on free speech in many countries are done in the name of national security, a very elastic concept. Before handing it over to, and here are the highlights which change as we go along. Before handing it over to the panel, let me just make one last point. Many people could react to this hearing it presented by a middle-aged, not unwhite man, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, speaking with an Oxford accent, coming from somewhere not unconnected with the history of the West, might see this as a kind of Western liberal imperialist project, right? And sometimes people don't like to articulate that, but it's somehow there, sort of reluctance in the role. And so I want, and actually in Cairo, this was very, very clear it was there. And it certainly will be in China. And I want to address that head on. Of course, these are liberal principles. There are no two ways around that. But they are liberal propositions for working towards a more universal universalism. I was very much influenced by a book by Immanuel Wallerstein, which I commend to you, which is called European Universalism, which starts by showing all the many, many ways in which European universalism has been profoundly un-universal, inconsistent and hypocritical. And then at a certain point he says, but there is nothing to stop us engaging on the enterprise of trying to create global values. Right? Trying to create global values. How do we do that? Normative universalism, as I would call it. Answer, you put the proposition on the table and then you engage fully in the debate. That's how you start the conversation moving towards a more universal universalism. Now, as it happens, these are draft principles, and I emphasize draft. So they'll be revised. This is not the final version. Actually, come May, we'll have a revised version of that. They are the product of long debates by workshops of free speech experts, lawyers, theologians, political scientists, politicians, journalists, bloggers from all over the world who we brought together to debate these. So they're not just a Western product. Our research team consists of about 40 Oxford graduate students, native speakers of those 13 languages. So they are themselves incredibly diverse. They're Chinese, they're Russian, they're Indian, they're Pakistani, they're Arab, they're Turkish. And they themselves are fed into this project. So it really is not, in its design, a Western liberal imperialist project. Last but not least, we just put it on the table, out there, on the global virtual table, and on the table here today, and then we say, come in and tell us, please, what do you think we've got wrong, how we should reformulate these principles, how they should be applied in Turkey, what we've missed. And that's what I'd love to hear from the rest of the panel. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Thank you very much. 13 languages, 10 principles, 1 conversation. Well, we're right in the middle of it, I think. There is a hashtag for Twitter, which I forgot to mention at the beginning, but it's better late than never. It is FSD Turkey. FSD Turkey. I will now turn to Kerem.
Well, thank you, Aisha, very much for inviting me. And also, I mean, it's a great pleasure being here, considering that I'm the least accomplished on this wonderful panel of voyants and people who have a lot to say. Of course, I'll try also to make my bit. My idea was to give a bit of a critical kind of comment to Tim, who has now, by talking about the Western imperialism, taken a lot of wind out of my sails. But I thought it would still be good to give you a sense that there's a range of opportunities in Oxford and among the people who deal with the issue of free speech there. And what I will be basically trying to do is, of course I agree with Tim's proposition that freedom of speech is a most central and most important right. But I also believe that the context within which free speech happens and is experienced is also important. And I will try to speak about this context within which we do free speech. And I think that we can maybe, and that's what I will try to do today, is to try to distinguish between freedom of speech as a conservative project and the freedom of speech as an effort at liberating the individual from the shackles of inequality, with a more kind of, let's say, a more enlightenment perspective. And much of what I will share with you is based on my discussions at Oxford, and especially with my colleagues Rim Abu El-Fadl, Miriam Asfar, Mesna Katwa, and Uthman Ahmedani. And you already have realized they're all names of people with a Muslim background, and maybe that will come through in the discussion. So allow me to begin by stating that the societal and political context of any liberty, including, of course, the freedom of speech, is that of unequal power relations, whether in Turkey, in the UK, or elsewhere. Our capitalist societies are characterized by a wide range of inequalities, whether they're democratic, whether those countries are democratic and liberal as in the UK, semi-authoritarian and liberal as in Turkey, or dictatorial as in most of Turkey's eastern neighbors. To cite just a few such inequalities: wealth and social class, gender, race and ethnicity, religion, and of course also history and geography, which Tim alluded to in his closing points. And I think it is this topography of inequalities and our position in this topography that shapes our subjectivity. And think of subjectivity here as the way in which we perceive of the world around us, based on our experiences, and also as the resources we possess to interact with the social reality outside ourselves. And it is this subjectivity that shapes what we see, think, and say, how we express it. And let me give you a few examples for each of these inequalities and explore how they inform our position in the world and how they impact on the issue of free speech. Wealth and social class, for instance. It makes a difference whether you're born into a middle-class neighborhood in the southeast of the UK, which, unlike in Turkey, is the most prosperous part of the country, or in a council estate in a former industrial town in the UK's north. If the latter was the case, your educational career will have been shaped by not so good schools and less motivated teachers. The likelihood of you being accepted to an Oxford college will be close to zero. And you will speak with a local accent that is considered unsophisticated. And you might well lack the social capital and language abilities to explain your grievances clearly and effectively. So let's name a disadvantaged young man with that kind of history, Jack. And we'll come back to Jack. And compare his position of disadvantage to the experience of our hypothetical middle-class kid. Let's assume he made it to Eton and studied at Oxford and knows all you need to know to get your ideas and concerns across to those who matter. And let's call him Sebastian, for instance. It's a Prussian name, of course. So when Jack and Sebastian meet, will they be able to talk on equal footing? If the two have to speak to the police or the media, who will be taken more seriously by those in power and by those who matter? Jack or Sebastian? Talk about gender. As a woman, if you do not have the privilege of being born into a middle-class family in Western Turkey, you will be at a disadvantage from the first steps of your education. You'll be socialized into subservient behavior towards your significant men. Fathers, uncles, husbands, policemen, judges. Your horizon for your job prospects and your place in the world will be severely limited. You are very likely to be subjected to violence from your childhood onwards. Society will expect you to be a good mother, who dedicates herself to her family and to the well-being of her husband. If you fail to achieve these, you will be considered a failure, or worse, a loose woman. If you comply, you will hardly ever be rewarded. With such a biography, will you be able to make your voice heard? Can you speak to your husband as two equal adults would do? Are you an equal participant in the public debate? The question. Now, race and ethnicity. Imagine you're born in Germany as a child of immigrants from Africa. You have been subjected to racial abuse from the first moment your mother brought you to the kindergarten. You never understood why people would look at you and laugh. In high school, your teachers would ask where you were from, and you wouldn't know what to say, as you've never been to the birthplace of your parents. So you would give the name of your German city of birth, And you would get a knowing look at the question, but where are you really from? Where are you really from? It's clear that you're not from Germany. Even though your German is not only impeccable, but also displays the local dialect, you would have understood that most Germans do not accept the idea that a black person can be German. Now think for a moment. If most people in Germany opine that your racial properties, i.e. being black, excludes you from being considered a proper German, from which position will you speak in a discussion of citizenship, for instance? Religion, which is of course very much at the heart of the free speech debate. And I'd like to give an example from France and then from Turkey. Being a Muslim in France obviously is not great fun. First of all, you have to deal with the socio-economic deprivation of many Muslims who are born into dismal social housing estates in the suburbs. But then you will always be approached with great measure of suspicion by the majority population. Your non-Muslim neighbors might suspect you of involvement in terrorist activities. If you're a young man wearing a hoodie in the banlieue, you will be strip searched by the police. If you are a woman wearing the hijab, the Muslim headscarf and so on, you will get the occasional stare or might be spitted at. And I've seen this happening, it does happen. If you're not a muhajjaba, a woman with a headscarf, your brother, your local gangmaster, or the radical imam might do actually exactly the same. But even if you're well educated and middle class, you will have to explain yourself quite a lot for things you don't feel strongly attached to. Do you support suicide bombings? Are you for or against the cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad? Is the veil a sign of oppression of women? And why do Muslims eat halal meat? And in the end, you will have to make do in a public sphere where the president has declared the issue of halal meat as one of the key concerns of France and promised to ban it from schools. Considering all this, how will you feel? Empowered as a citizen of the French Republic? Or will you tire from having to explain yourself all the time? Will you search for a random Norwegian tourist on the Champs-Élysées and question him whether he supports Anders Breivik, for instance, and why Norwegians are capable of such terrible acts of killing children? Of course, at least in Europe, few enlightened observers will pose such a question to a Norwegian tourist. Thanks to cultural proximity and the assumption that we're not so different, most will be able to differentiate and distinguish and suggest that this was the act of an extremist who has bought into a dehumanizing ideology. Yet the same understanding is not usually extended to those who are deemed culturally more distant, as is the case of Muslims in many European countries and obviously also with non-Muslims in Turkey. One more example to bring this exploration of the free speech in a landscape of inequalities to a provisional conclusion. Let us turn, for instance, toward the Alevi community of this country, and the same could be said, of course, for the Armenians or any other non-Sunni mainstream community. As a Turkish citizen of Alevi faith, you have to operate within the context of an essentially non-secular country. The Diyanet, the Directorate for Religious Services, is a service institution, you all know that, of course, with more than 100,000 state employees, serves in tens of thousands of mosques. All this is financed with your taxes. However, this state institution only serves the Sunni Muslims in this country. In fact, it also propagates and imposes the Sunni Muslim tradition on you. In essence, you have to pay taxes for an institution that would wish nothing more than converting you to the true path and reduce your religion to a subordinate form of worship. On top of this, your state bureaucracy, your judiciary, and your educational system is of predominantly Sunni Muslim orientation. If the government suggested starting a dialogue, which in fact, of course, it did a couple of years ago, would you feel, as an Alevi, that the time has come for an enlightened discussion between equals, or would you feel the threat of conversion and belittling of your distinct tradition? And how would you react, for instance, if you were the odd Alevi in a talk show with 10 establishment Sunni Muslims who all think that Alevism is just a subculture within Islam, while you're trying to defend the idea that it is not? And now I'm finishing talking about these subjectivities and also my thought. So it's history and geography. I'm sure those of you who come from a post-colonial and subaltern studies background have been waiting eagerly, and Timothy has already mentioned it, of course, but the unequal power relations are, of course, contained also in history and geography, and hence do matter. And it doesn't mean, we just need to be aware of them, I think. So if if you speak as a British intellectual in Germany, it has a different meaning than when you speak in Turkey, when you speak in Egypt, and when you speak in Iran. And we have to be, I think, aware, because every word, and this is true for a Turk, of course, speaking in Egypt, or in Iran, or in Germany as well, every word and thought will gain or lose meaning, be understood or misunderstood in this particular context. And such examples could be multiplied indefinitely, of course, and every member of a marginalized social group, whether LGBT individuals, members of religious or ethnic minorities, immigrants or disabled people, will have many such experiences of inequality to talk about. What is important for us today, I think, is to remind ourselves of the context within which we speak and the power relations within which we are bound to operate. The context matters, and we have to understand its complexity. This is reminiscent of European suspicions towards Jews in the 20th century. Yet, if a secular court in Turkey decides that the remark of a non-Muslim or an atheist has offended Muslim values, we need to ask, how can the member of a marginalized and disempowered minority offend the overwhelming majority? How come that a judge would need to defend the majority against the minority and the powerful against the weak? The same goes, of course, for the crime of insulting Turkishness in a society where Turks are in the majority and the state is based on the very ideology of ethno-nationalism. Based on these questions, really, I would like to invite you to subject to critical scrutiny the position from which you speak, and that there be, of course, no misunderstanding, almost done. Becoming aware of the context of free speech and of the topography of inequalities, as I've tried to call it, does not diminish the value and the promise of its exercise. Quite the opposite. Only if we become aware of the inequalities that determine our individual and collective subjectivities, can we bring liberties to full fruition, I think. And this is for me also the most important distinction there, really, between freedom of speech as a work of enlightenment as opposed to freedom of speech as a conservative project. Because enlightenment is, of course, not only man's emergence from a self-imposed immaturity, but also our emergence from the immaturity imposed upon us by others. So this is my thank you.
Thank you, Ken.
I would like to thank Professor Kadıoğlu, Professor Keyman for inviting me for this organization, and also Granting Foundation and Istanbul Policy Center. I've been asked to talk about today hate speech and hate crimes in the media, in Turkish media, of course. My roadmap will be shortly, because we've got limited time, I think 15 minutes. First, I thought to do a bit of, I'm not a good person for the PowerPoint presentations, but I just wanted to give some, then I changed my mind. Just to be quick and be successful in the time management, I think it's much better to read fast as soon as possible. Mainstream media in Turkey, time to time, deny humane values to otherize groups, justify and legitimize humiliation and violence inflicted on these groups. While media reproduce nationalism and racism as tools of the hegemonic ideology, they also produce hatred and cause these feelings to be forwarded to the others. Nowadays, the media are not using hate speech as obvious as in the past in lurid headlines such as dirty gypsy, coward Jew, Armenian offspring. However, hate speech is included in columns and news, and especially in the social media, and therefore the fight against it became more difficult and essential. I'm sure most of you know the definition of hate speech. In 1997, the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe adopted a recommendation on hate speech, which stated the term shall be understood as covering all forms of expression which spread, incite, promote or justify racial hatred, xenophobia, anti-Semitism or other forms of hatred based on intolerance, including intolerance expressed by aggressive nationalism and ethnocentrism, discrimination and hostility against minorities, migrants, and people of immigrant origin. Hate speech that externalize and other the others and putting them on the target board can create and reinforce enmity against certain groups through tactics such as exaggeration, distortion, and humiliation. Hate speech has a twofold intent: to demoralize and degrade a person or people based on their membership in an identifiable social group, and to impart more power and privilege to the speaker and his or her group. It may be sometimes difficult to diagnose hate speech because hate discourse doesn't necessarily always express itself with hate and emotional expressions. Sometimes the discourse may seem very rational and normal. The European Commission 2011 Progress Report on Turkey emphasizes that anti-Semitism and hate speech in the media targeting missionaries or Christians in general remain an important issue. Despite national and international calls, the Turkish government has not addressed hate speech and hate crimes in the country. Therefore, Turkish media has absolute freedom in publishing reports and commentaries full of insulting and defamatory content. Not only are the issues reported with extreme manipulation of the facts, based on ideological and political affiliations of the newspaper, they often include hate speech. The Association for Social Change, of which I'm also one of the advisory board member, is a leading organization focusing on the hate issue in Turkish media. Our 2009 report, entitled Hate Crimes in the National Media, 10 Years, 10 Cases, covers the years between 1998 and 2008 and focuses on a large selection of newspapers that represents most political and ideological sides in Turkey. The organization's researchers investigated hate speech instances in 10 categories, including ethnic background, nationality, gender, sexual orientation, and religious affiliation. Of the 30,000 articles and commentaries investigated, the researchers analyzed 200 pieces in detail and provided 10 textbook cases of hate speech for each category. According to this study, 47% of all hate speech instances are related to ethnic identity. It's followed by religion, 20%, national identity, 11%, and political affiliation, 11% also. Of all the newspapers studied, Yeni Şafak, Milli Gazete, Vakit and Zaman, all conservative newspapers and staunch supporters of the AK ruling party have the highest number of hate speech content about religious identity. The study also revealed that there is more hate speech against certain groups in certain dates. For instance, before or on April 24, Genocide Remembrance Day in Armenia of every year, there was a recognizable increase in the negative and discriminatory discourse against the Armenians. Similarly, before or on March 21st, Newroz discourse against the Kurds and the Kurdish identity was more offensive. Another important finding that must be mentioned here is that hate speech about sexual orientation and identity is common in almost all newspapers, regardless of their political and ideological affiliation. I want to give you some striking examples of hate speech, recent ones. A rally that was organized with a just and legitimate demand, the protest of the massacre committed by Armenian soldiers 20 years ago in Azeri soil in Karabakh at Kocaeli, and the commemoration of those who died in the attack, unfortunately turned into an organization dominated by racism and hate speech. Banners that were held during the demonstration reading, "You are all Armenians, you are all bastards," or the fact that those who cannot approach this atrocity with humanitarian consciousness are all Armenians is because of the bestialities reflected a mentality instigating hate. Just as thought-provoking was that some demonstrators in the rally were able to chant slogans such as "We are all O Gün Samas," the convicted murderer of Armenian Turkish journalist Hrant Dink, and "Grey Walls," the political symbol of extreme nationalists, are here. Where are the Hrants? These slogans contain a context that openly embraced, blessed, and encouraged a murder. We all know that hate speech can easily lead to hate crimes, and the best example for this is the murder of Turkish Armenian chief editor of Armenian Agos newspaper, Hrant Dink, in front of his office in 2007. Dink was killed because of his Armenian identity. According to court documents, O gün Samas, Dink's murderer, did not even know Dink's proper name. He just knew that he was an Armenian. Dink was identified as a target not only by the nationalist and discriminatory media, but also by the media publishing in line with Islamism. Hrant Dink had been made a target by the media within 10 days after Agos newspaper had reported a statement about Sabiha Gökçen, the adopted daughter of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, founder of the Turkish Republic. The Armenian Weekly had claimed that Gökçen originated from an Armenian family as the world's first female combat pilot and the first Turkish aviatrix. Atatürk's adopted daughter held an important place in the model of society developed in Turkey after 1950. Subsequent to the according report in Agos newspaper, officials voiced threats, and it was stated in the media that Gökçen came from a Bosnian family instead of an Armenian one. Some journalists felt the necessity to remind the readers about Hrant Dink's article titled "Under Armenian Identity," which had not been on the agenda of the media at that time, which would later cause him to put on trial for violation of Article 301. I'm jumping to another, how many minutes do I have?
Go for it.
5 more minutes. I've got some more examples which I wanted to show, but just a commentary, for example, appeared in Yeni Akit in November 2011 entitled "Generous Jewish Son-in-Laws," aims to vilify and defame the Turkish military because some of its generals have son-in-laws who open to be a Jewish origin. Here the purpose is to attack the presumed opponents of AK party and the Islamist ideology in the newspaper represents by associating them with something or someone that is Jewish, as if it's something threatening, immoral or bad. Since early 2011, there has been a visible increase in stories in which PKK members eat pork and exercise shamanic rituals, while the security forces find bodies of uncircumcised PKK members. Reports about PKK members converting in masses to Christianity to obtain financial support from Christian aid and missionary organizations are also being circulated regularly in newspapers like Yeni Akit Milli Gazete. Another organization, Kaos GN, a lesbian group, the most active NGO promoting the rights of LGBT community on Turkey's High Court of Appeals. Kaos GN's lawsuit against Yeni Akit was initially rejected by 2 Ankara courts on the grounds that the newspaper was within the limits of criticism. The Supreme Court of Appeals, however, overruled the previous decision, stressing that the freedom of the press does not encompass the freedom to insult the personal freedom of individuals. Do we have hate speech legislation in Turkey? No, but the Turkish Penal Code does have legislation against spreading hate speech, inciting of hatred, Article 216. Ironically enough, this article is being used to silence dissident voices, especially Kurdish politicians, and journalists are being convicted of it. For example, when they demand more rights for Kurds, or if they file reports about the PKK fighters, a typical example of that legislation. The law can be interpreted in many ways, so you can use it to convict whoever you want to. And the article is a sister of the infamous Article 301 that makes insulting Turkishness a punishable offense. Such laws are being used to curtail freedom of speech. Now I'm just going to jump to hate crimes, which I'm very much interested in. Now we are in the period for preparing anti-hate legislation in Turkey. We all know that hate crimes are committed worldwide based on ethnicity, nationality, religious affiliation, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, physical or mental disability. We are putting these new social status, political and philosophical opinions, or educational background. The nature of these crimes may vary from harassment, insult, damage to possessions, property, violence in the schools or workplace to violent attacks or murder. Many victims are Roma, Kurds, LGBTs, Christians, and Alevi, a liberal path in Islam. We are very rich in hate crimes. In Turkey, I'm not going to go so back. Since 2006, Friar Santoro's murder in Trabzon, Hrant Dink's murder 2007, the massacre of the Malatya Zirve Publishing Company 2007, the attempted lynching of Roma community in Selendi, Manisa 2010, the violent acts against Kurdish people in different provinces, districts of the frequent and LGBT murders covered by the media are all examples of hate crimes. Hate crimes prevent the integration of victims and groups into society and weaken their belief in social justice. These crimes damage the supremacy of law and the trust in public structures and institutions, feed the hatred and prejudice between certain groups, and when not properly persecuted, encourage the prejudiced individuals and groups who may commit new crimes which marginalizes certain groups and push them to the fringe of society. So, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE, tries to get legislation against hate crimes established in the whole of Europe. To that end, the OSCE cooperates intensively with local groups, including in Turkey with the Association for Social Change, the NGO of which I just told that I am the advisory board. The good news is, I'm finishing, there is growing public attention on hate speech and hate crimes in Turkey. In January 2012, only 2 months ago, more than 58, something like, I thought I was, Cengiz Aktar'da was
yes,
better than something
it's
like
around
it was 60, over 60. NGOs announced that they have to come together in a campaign to demand hate crimes legislation in the new Turkish Constitution. The campaign of hate crime legislation is perhaps the most important step today in Turkey for addressing hate speech and hate crimes. I want to finish it, I have to, because we still need more than those. You told me that, you or Timothy said that anti-hate speech legislations are sometimes could be much more dangerous, but that's why we are not preparing a hate speech but a hate crimes legislation. But we still, I believe, need more than those. For example, if you look at Kosovo, it has the words maybe best anti-hate crime legislation, but you don't see any of that when you look at practice. So creating awareness among the public also is very important. Increasing people's sensitivity on this issue would be much more effective than amending the law sometimes. And also the responsibility of the media. Media should consider hate crimes under human rights and should not disregard representation and participation of the groups which are the targets of hate crimes in production and presentation of news. It should keep its agenda focused on the point that Turkey must immediately produce her hate crimes law. Responsible and democratic media do not strive to nourish and intensify a polarization of us and them. On the contrary, sets the stage for an intercultural dialogue based on mutual goodwill and understanding and respect. Thank you very much.